It's nice to see a full house for a discussion of neoliberalism. So yes, this is Beyond Neoliberalism, Rethinking the Role of the State in the New Global Age. My name is Noam Maggor. I'm a historian at Queen Mary, University of London, and I'm a research fellow here at the IA this year. This roundtable is part of our two-day history conference on the American developmental state in the 19th century that I organized in close collaboration with Nicolas Barreyre, Sofia Valeonti, and Ariel Ron. This has, for us, has already been a full day of brilliant discussions of history. But this evening, we turn to engage with the more recent past, the present, and the future. Specifically, this conversation will try to assess whether indeed the neoliberal era is coming or has already in some ways come to a close, and whether we are indeed moving to a new approach to governance that embraces a more active role for government. Also, whether indeed globalization, as we have known it, is drawing to a close to be replaced by some accounts with deglobalization, or perhaps more realistically, a very different global system. At the core of this conversation are several bold initiatives launched by the Biden administration, which would frankly be unthinkable under previous administrations. Most prominently, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that has been pouring $1.2 trillion in spending on transportation, broadband access, clear water, and electric grid renewal, the CHIPS and Science Act. This is about $280 billion into the domestic development and manufacturing of semiconductors. The Inflation Reduction Act, $400 billion in funding for clean technology. These initiatives, to quote from the White House page, aim to implement industrial strategy to revitalize domestic manufacturing, create good-paying American jobs, strengthen American supply chains, and accelerate the industries of the future. In other words, the Biden administration has embraced the logic and rhetoric of a highly interventionist industrial policy, which not too long ago was totally taboo, literally the policy that shall not be named. These moves have resounded around the world, in Asia, where these policies have been viewed as an effort to stifle Chinese economic ascendance, and in Europe, where similar policies are being contemplated. So are we indeed at the forefront of something new? And if yes, what are the implications for us as citizens, as progressive people, and of course, as researchers in the humanities and social sciences? Join us to reflect on these recent developments are a historian, a political scientist, and an economist. I'll introduce them in order. First, Gary Gerstle, who is Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge. Gary's most recent book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era, was shortlisted for last year's Financial Times Business Book of the Year. Second, Dr. Felicia Wong, who's president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, a progressive think tank that champions new ideas and aims to make our economy and democracy work for the many, not the few. She's also a co-host of a terrific podcast, which I recommend, called How to Save a Country, where you can literally hear how ideas that were not too long ago relegated to the radical fringes are becoming commonsensical. And finally, Thomas Piketty, who's a professor at EHESS and the Paris School of Economics. He's the co-director of the World Inequality Lab, World Inequality Database. He's the author of Capital in the 21st Century, Capital and Ideology, and most recently, A Brief History of Equality. Thomas once argued that neoliberalism has encouraged wealth hoarding rather than productive investment, so I wonder to what extent he's seeing a departure from that. I'm curious to hear. So we will begin with remarks of roughly 15 minutes from each of them, followed up with some discussion, and we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So Gary, why don't you get us started?
This is on. You can hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Noam and the other organizers of this conference, and I'm delighted to be on this panel. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation. In my 15 minutes, I'm going to make a case for this moment in the United States, and by implication, other parts of the world, is a moment of inflection. I think that what I call the neoliberal order has fractured, and it's opened up possibilities for politics that had not existed previously. I have a feeling Felicia and maybe Thomas may point more to the obstacles of what we're encountering in terms of transitioning to a different world. I want to make the case for the possibilities of this moment. In my book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, I talk about neoliberalism not just as an ideology, but as a political order. And by political order, I mean a political formation consisting of parties, think tanks, policy networks, media platforms, jurisprudential influence on the courts, and last but not least, the vision of a good life that ramifies throughout the society. An order in the United States endures beyond the 2-, 4-, and 6-year election cycles that dominate so much of the discussion of American politics. An order can dominate for as much as 30 or 40 years. The ultimate test of a political order's influence is whether it can bend to its will a political party that is its ostensible opposition. And my argument is that the GOP did this to the Democratic Party in the 1990s. Bill Clinton was the instrument of the Democrats' acquiescence to the core policies of the Reagan Revolution. And I argue, and I still believe, that Clinton in some ways did more to advance deregulation than what Reagan himself had done in financial markets, in technology sector, in electricity, in hemispheric and global free trade. But it's not, the point is not to make Clinton into a villain. It's to understand how the core ideas of a political order, when dominant, can ramify throughout the political class and beyond. And even individuals who we usually think of as resisting neoliberalism got caught up in it, even people such as Joe Stiglitz, who would be the last person we would list as a neoliberal. In his book, The Roaring '90s, trying to understand his role in the Clinton administration, he quotes Kennedy in Berlin in the 60s saying, "We are all Berliners now." And Stiglitz said, reflecting on the 1990s, "I don't really understand how this happened, but we all became deregulators in the 1990s, abandoning what we should have known and what we should have done." The larger point here is that if a political order is successful, forms of meaningful dissent get squashed or chased to the margins. And thus did the neoliberal order that emerged in the 1970s and 80s and triumphed in the 1990s and 2000s. This was an order that took over, in a sense, both the Republican and Democratic parties, and not even Obama, in my view, escaped its influence. In retrospect, we can see that the 2008-2009 global financial crash upended neoliberalism's prestige, its hegemony. It took a while for the descent from neoliberalism to manifest itself, but by the middle of the 20-teens, the direction of travel was clear. Rebellion against neoliberalism came from the right and from the left. On the right, it began with the Tea Party in 2010 and accelerated dramatically in 2016 with Trump becoming president. Rebellion on the left began with Occupy Wall Street in 2011, gained momentum from Black Lives Matter in 2014, and then intensified further via Bernie Sanders' rise in the US in 2016. The hegemony of the neoliberal order was cracking in what has now been a decade of fissuring. All kinds of ideas, formerly considered heterodox, unworkable, even dangerous, have moved into the mainstream of political discussion in the US. I shall focus on the ideas of the left. We shall leave the ideas of the right for another occasion, not because they are unimportant, but because I only have 15 minutes. Most broadly, this movement of ideas in left and progressive circles manifests itself in rethinking the relationship of states to markets. The core neoliberal idea was freeing capitalism and the markets that it requires from constraints. Let the animal spirits of capitalism soar. The market, neoliberals argued, was the most effective allocator of investment, production, labor, etc. There was a role for the state in this market-centered ideology. We may think of that role as establishing laws and institutions that would ensure that free markets would work smoothly and efficiently, what Quinn Slobodian has called a project of encasement. In the imagination of neoliberals, this role for the state was radically new in the annals of liberalism. In fact, it was not. As the many historians of the 19th century US state present in this room at this very moment can attest, it was part and parcel of 19th century liberalism as well. Walter Lippmann made this point nearly 100 years ago in a seminal book, largely ignored now, The Good Society. This was the manifesto that underwrote the colloque Lippmann in Paris in 1938, which was the first international assembly of those who were identifying themselves as neoliberals. Markets, Lippmann insisted, never have and never will spring from nature. They are human creations and have to be built by human hands and managed by law, law that itself has to be constructed, amended, and maintained through market-oriented institutions. Without governments and legal codes, markets will languish at low levels of efficiency. Still, the role of government in classical liberalism and in neoliberalism was strictly limited. It was seen as an enabler of markets, not as a controller or regulator of markets in the pursuit of some larger public interest. That core belief animated neoliberalism profoundly. There were corollaries to this belief. First, in a global economic system in which market perfection was achieved and maintained, all individuals would benefit. It was said, all boats would rise. No one believes this anymore, except perhaps for Liz Truss, whose policies seemed so dangerous and her claims so preposterous that she was unceremoniously sacked, not by the Labor Party or some great assembly of the left, but by capital itself, the banks of the City of London and Wall Street. The second corollary is that market freedom would promote political freedom. That was the great hope regarding China. Admit China to the WTO, immerse that Leninist society in processes of market exchange, and demands for liberal democracy would accelerate, leading to the fall of communism and its replacement with a democratic form of socialism and even perhaps liberal democracy. That has not happened, and no one believes any longer that it will. Faith in core neoliberal principles and its corollaries has lapsed. Meanwhile, in the US, a progressive political movement has taken shape across the last 10 years, accelerating dramatically, first across Bernie Sanders' 2 runs for the Democratic nomination, and then across the Biden administration. Biden is no leftist. You heard it here. Historically, he has not even been a progressive. But at some point across America's interminable election season of 2019-2020, and America's election seasons are interminable, he grasped that the US had reached an inflection point. Neoliberal policies were no longer working and had to be modified, even abandoned. The heritage of Clinton and even Obama repudiated. In summer 2020, immediately after becoming nominee of the Democratic Party, he entered into serious dialogue with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. 6 task forces were set up to find common ground. And out of that dialogue, the most serious such dialogue between the left and center of the Democratic Party in almost 100 years, major new legislative initiatives emerged. A massive $5 trillion social infrastructure bill, a $2 trillion Rescue America bill, a major $2 trillion physical infrastructure bill. Lying within this vast social infrastructure bill was the most ambitious green energy program ever put forward by the Democratic Party. Those of you who follow American politics know that those ambitious plans, with the exception of the American Rescue Plan, got chopped up, often mercilessly, in the sausage-making factory, also known as the US Congress. But what emerged from these legislative sessions was still significant. A $1 trillion infrastructure bill, a massive bill to restore the manufacture of computer chips, and a $400 billion green energy bill. At the core of these pieces of legislation was the conviction that the relationship of states to markets had to be rethought, and it had to be rethought fundamentally. No one is giving nationalization of private industry in the US much thought, but in numerous places, thinkers, politicians, social movements are calling for government to intervene in capitalist processes of investment, manufacture, and labor to the point where the entire system can be harnessed to serve the public interest. This was the core belief of Roosevelt's New Deal. It has now reawakened. This reawakening is evident in the degree to which Biden himself has moved left on these matters. It is evident in the presence within his administration of a significant group of progressives, even leftists, who have been given important portfolios. It is evident in the stunning speech that Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, gave a month ago to the Brookings Institution the week that the IMF was meeting in Washington, essentially declaring that America would not be secure until livelihoods of millions of Americans was secured through domestic government action. This is not your Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor. He was pointing his way to a new Washington consensus, dramatically different from the old Washington consensus. It is evident, too, in the decision of numerous progressive foundations to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into supporting thinkers, universities, and think tanks, where ideas for a post-neoliberal economy are being developed. These ideas cover a broad front: industrial policy, green energy policy, social care, child care, racial justice, anti-monopoly initiatives, either to break up the huge social media companies or to put them under strict regulation. These ideas are emerging from the Hewlett Foundation, which is pouring $100 million into it, from the Open Society Foundations, which is undergoing a major rethink of priorities, tilting more than ever in the direction of political economy, and the Berggruen Institute, one of whose leaders, Niels Gilman, sitting in our audience this evening, is here today, which is dramatically ramping up its work in these areas, and the newly vigorous Roosevelt Institute, led by fellow panelist Felicia Wong, which has made itself a critical hub for developing ideas for industrial policy and moving them from the drawing board through the Biden administration and into the realm of implementation. These institutes and foundations all have the same model in mind: the work done by neoliberal think tanks and foundations set up in the 1970s that powered the ascent of the neoliberal order: the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, the Bradley Foundation, so on and so forth. I could name another 6. Some of you may be asking, yes, but what does all this ideational work amount to? To which I have 2 responses. First, it is necessary, even essential work. The neoliberal thinkers spent 30 years in the ideological wilderness before they began to get political traction. They never lost hope or conviction. They had girded themselves for the long march. Second, ideas are never sufficient unto themselves. They must be seen as addressing material matters, economic matters that other toolkits of ideas could not satisfactorily address. The ideas of the neoliberal think tanks of the 1970s mattered because they were perceived as addressing issues of stagflation, recession, and slow growth that Keynesianism had not. The ideas of the new progressive think tanks must be seen as addressing real-world problems in ways that neoliberalism failed to do. The opportunity to do so presents itself not just because of the realization of how unsatisfactory the neoliberal toolkit has been these last 30 years. The opportunity is here as well because of 2 factors that we may see as exogenous to the global economy, but that now have become endogenous to it: the pandemic and the war between Russia and Ukraine. COVID unleashed on the world threats of death so massive that populations everywhere were willing to grant their states extraordinary power, including the power to shut down entire economies or entire districts of the economy, to shut schools, to stop travel, to confine people to their homes and neighborhoods. Everywhere mistakes were made, of course, but the demonstration of power that inheres in states was nevertheless extraordinary. Even the Federal Reserve, a state central bank, engaged in experimentation that it had never tried before. We don't have to go all the way with Andreas Malm, the Swedish eco-radical, for whom the response to the pandemic inspired dreams of bringing back Lenin and war communism, to understand that this moment was pregnant with possibility. My observations on these matters come with a caveat. We don't yet know how much state experimentation during the COVID crisis will prove to have been a temporary state of exception, a sphere of action regarded as legitimate only temporarily, like situations of extreme duress that war has occasioned in the past. We need to discuss this matter more than we have. Will the innovations of the COVID era last, or will we in 5 years be talking about how quickly this period of experimentation passed quietly into the night? I put that to you as a question. I genuinely don't know the answer to it. The second factor will prove to be more enduring in restructuring the relation of states and markets, or so I think. This is the war between Russia and Ukraine. A key principle of the neoliberal era was this: procure raw materials and manufactured goods as cheaply as possible, where the costs of extraction and manufacture were lowest. Location didn't matter because transportation was so quick and low cost. And procuring these materials internationally didn't matter either because the market economy had become global with every country participating in a major way. Of course, there were frictions between nations, but no discord between nations was perceived as capable of threatening global commerce or threatening the ease of passage of materials across national borders and shared waterways. Thus, a signature feature of the neoliberal global age, supply chains stretching endlessly around the world. COVID itself made a mess of these supply chains. I don't need to give you details about that. We've all lived the hardships from that. And then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Europe woke up to its massive dependence on oil and gas from a country now posing an existential threat to the European Union. Meanwhile, Russia was embargoing Ukraine grain, a vital source of food to numerous countries in the global south. In the midst of this crisis, governments began to ask this question: what raw materials, what manufactured goods can our society not do without? The immediate answer was grain, petroleum, computer chips, rare minerals such as those essential to the manufacture of electric cars, and protective equipment for hospital workers. And then governments asked a second question: how do we ensure the availability of these goods? Under neoliberalism, price was paramount. If that's the case, it is easy to say, let the market decide. When availability is paramount, then one can no longer say, let markets decide. To the contrary, it becomes incumbent upon states to intervene in markets. The nightmare scenario for multiple nations was not just Russia's threat to Ukraine, but China's threat to its own Ukraine, known to us as Taiwan. Taiwan produces a huge proportion of the world's computer chips. If the flow of those chips were to be stopped, a good part of the world's economy would grind to a halt. Given the fear generated by such scenarios, governments in many nations began to think about intervening in the economy to secure the flow of essential materials and goods. These sorts of interventions push forward the project of rethinking the relationship of states to markets. These interventions also broaden the project beyond the ranks of progressives. In the United States, the massive reshoring of chip production is happening not just because it fits within the parameters of a social democratic industrial policy. It is happening because the military-industrial complex of the United States wants it to happen for reasons of national security and profit. The broadening of support for such ventures in America thus represents both opportunity and peril. The opportunity lies in widening the base of political support beyond the ranks of progressives, beyond the ranks of the Democratic Party. The peril lies in the possibility that industrial policy will be captured by corporations and the military, leading to a politics pointing sharply away not just from a neoliberal past, but also from a social democratic future. There are other perils in the current moment. I don't want to be Pollyannish, even if I sound like it. One is this: Democrats have yet to demonstrate they can win anything more than the thinnest majorities in Congress. It's hard to push ahead with a transformational politics in such circumstances. And the cascade of elections in the United States gives any party so little time to put its ideas into effect before the next election cycle starts. The second peril is this: in the US, the industrial policy vanguard of the Biden administration confronts a state either hollowed out by years of Republican misrule or a state overwhelmed by lobbyists pushing special interests. There are other obstacles I could name, but I've given you enough of a sense now to indicate the scale of the problem. Volatility is everywhere. Nevertheless, I remain convinced that the opportunity to move beyond a neoliberal political economy is here. It's substantial, and the moment should be grasped. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. That was a perfect setup. In fact, I think I'm going to hit all of your points. I'm going to try to do this in a way that certainly talks about what has changed. And I'm happy also, either a little bit here or in the Q&A, to talk about how these things changed. I'm Felicia Wong. I run the Roosevelt Institute. And I think one of the reasons that I'm here is that Roosevelt has been at the forefront of many of these changes. We argued for an American industrial policy way back in 2018, which feels like a very long time ago. And we've been arguing for many of the things that are now part of a kind of post-neoliberal American and hopefully global economics, including stronger labor force, stronger fiscal policy, much, much, much higher taxation. We've been arguing for this for at least a decade, you know, in the spirit of Franklin and Eleanor. We come by the Roosevelt honest. So what I want to talk about today is exactly what Gary laid out so magisterially, which is what are the major changes in the view of the state that we have seen. But I want to put those ideas in tension or in contrast with the actual use of state capacity as we see it now in the United States. I often find myself doing a lot of volunteer work for the US government. I served on the G7 panel for economic resilience. I currently serve on Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's Advisory Committee on Race Equity. And so I have seen some of the things that work quite well in the American government, and I have also seen some of the ways in which, in fact, we are trying to promote a post-neoliberal policy through what is essentially a neoliberal state apparatus. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, that tension. But I do agree with Gary that the changes in the ideas are far beyond anything I would have anticipated when I started my work at the Roosevelt Institute a dozen years ago. And I, too, wanted to start out with the Jake Sullivan quote. Jake, the National Security Advisor for the President of the United States. I'm actually going to quote from that speech because I do think it was such an important marker. Of course, Brian Deese, who had been the National Economic Council Advisor, had made 3 or 4 very important speeches about an American industrial strategy. He would call it strategy, not policy. He would often say, it's like, seems more like active if you say strategy. But I think it was very important also that Jake, as a national security advisor, pick up this mantle. And he did so, as Gary said, just a few weeks ago. And so let me just read a little bit from his speech. The United States, under President Biden, is pursuing a modern industrial and innovation strategy, both at home and with partners around the world. This is a strategy in which the state invests in the sources of our own economic and technological strength. We promote diversified and resilient global supply chains. We set high standards for everything from labor and the environment to trusted technology and good governance. And the state also deploys capital to deliver on public goods like climate and health. Now, that may sound like just good common sense to many of the people in this room, but I can assure you that coming from the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, this is in fact a sea change. Because what we see now is an American government that is willing to utilize state tools that had been previously completely off the table in the old Reagan, Clinton, Obama model. Maybe I should put Carter in there too, Gary. We do, in fact, see this government the Biden administration enthusiastically embracing antitrust, enthusiastically embracing government regulation of monopoly actors. This government has been very, very, very expansive in a kind of labor market supporting fiscal policy. True, that was kicked into motion by the pandemic, but it was very, very, very important. And it is one of the major reasons that in the United States, you see such quick labor market recovery after the COVID job losses, and you now see an unemployment rate that is lower than 4%, which is unbelievable for those of us who lived through the long, slow, jobless recession of just 10 years ago. And then again, of course, you also see all of this direct government investment in green industry, which is essentially subsidizing an entire new clean tech supply chain. So this is unbelievable. I mean, really, 18 months ago, 20 months ago, 24 months ago, there is no way I thought we were going to see any of this. These were like a few white papers that a few friends of mine and I were like peddling on Capitol Hill. There is no way we thought this was going to happen. And again, I'm happy to talk about how it happened. I will say one thing, just as a little bit of a breadcrumb. It's because you have to get really, really, really good people in power, and you have to know how to get those people in power. Not the elected offices, sure, but the deputy secretaries, the deputies to the National Economic Council, maybe even the NEC director himself and now herself. But you have to make sure that if you are, progressives have to actually contest for those jobs for decades had basically gone to capital, and progressives now have to contest for them. So that is one of the ways in which a lot of these ideas became real. Those ideas are now walking around the White House, I can tell you. But the question really is whether this change in thinking and even this change in personnel will ultimately result in a change in action. So I'm going to give you 4 quick examples, and they really illustrate this tension that I feel every day. So the first is the example of antitrust or anti-monopoly. Some of you, certainly if you're in the United States or follow American politics, you know who Lina Khan is. Lina Khan was a young lawyer who, I think she's 32 or 33 now, so when she was a law student at Yale just a few years ago, she wrote a paper that was a blockbuster called The Amazon Antitrust Paradox. She went to work for the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which governs most anti-monopoly policy. She was an advisor to Rohit Chopra. And, they were sort of this renegade, just the two of them in the corner of the FTC. But when Biden was, this was under Trump, when Biden was elected, he made her chair, right? This is incredible. And she has said that she wants to regulate artificial intelligence, that she wants to ban non-competes for workers, which prevent low-wage workers from being able to, move from Subway sandwich to, I don't know, potbelly sandwich or whatever. But the question really is whether she will actually be able to do these things. She has yet to really win any significant fights, and there is a lot of private money, a lot of lobbyist money arrayed against her. This is going to be very, very, very challenging. So that's one example. Great personnel. We have yet to see any real significant changes. One example. The second example is actually an example of the welfare state and social insurance. This actually goes back to the American Rescue Plan, which was passed just after Biden came into office. And it was something we don't often talk about when we talk about Bidenomics or the new industrial policy. But this was $1.9 trillion. $1.9 trillion. That is more than twice what Obama passed. There's 2.5 times what Obama passed at the height of the Great Recession. And this came on the wave of the CARES Act, which had been about similarly sized earlier during the Trump administration. But this was an incredible amount of fiscal policy that supported American families and supported American workers, and very importantly included an expanded child tax credit, which is really like Social Security for kids. And it ended up cutting child poverty in half. Cut child poverty in half in the United States. If you're an American, you know what that means. millions and millions and millions and millions of children went to bed not hungry because of the child tax credit. We actually demonstrated that in the United States, we know how to fight poverty, which is basically you should give people money. But the CTC, the child tax credit, is no longer part of it is no longer part of policy. It's expired. And I think there's a real risk that rather than learning the lesson, this is sort of what Gary said, but rather than learning the lesson that we actually know that generous policy will support workers, support families, that the American Rescue Plan will sort of fade away as a, it'll be sort of a penumbra of that that rescue period and really won't be genuine reform. I have two more examples. The third is climate, right? The Inflation Reduction Act is a striking piece of legislation. The early numbers, the early estimates were going to be that about $400 billion of government money in the form of tax credits was going to go to green industry. Actually, the estimates now are closer to 1.2 trillion because many of these tax credits were uncapped, and many companies who have many good lobbyists, by the way, rushed to take advantage of the tax credits. But I do think, and it's an enormous change because we move from pricing carbon, a kind of sticks model, which economists love and regular people don't love. We moved from that to a subsidies model or a carrots model, right? Where we're rewarding people who invest and companies who invest in decarbonization. So this is just absolutely profound. But what I really worry about is that all of the beneficiaries of all of this decarbonization money will end up being highly concentrated firms, big solar, governed by and for asset managers, because these are the kinds of people who understand how to take advantage of very complicated tax credits. And trust me, they are very complicated. The money's not out yet. Guidance is still being written by the Treasury Department, but there is just an enormous risk that we will not see a new green economy that's publicly owned by and for public benefit, and that is, yes, there's some in the legislation that permits that, but it's going to be pretty hard, very hard, in fact. And then the last piece that I will flag, and I don't mean to be, I sound glass like quarter full, which usually I'm like the most cheerful person in the room, but in this case, again, it's unbelievable that we've seen these changes, and yet I really worry. But the last piece I want to talk about is financialization in the large banks, because we did learn 12 years ago, 10 years ago, we learned, all of us learned, not just the economists, we all learned that intellectually the financialization of the economy, which means firms operating not for the sake of the real economy, but instead to make gains in a financialized market, we learned that this is very, 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 very bad. Everybody knows it, right? I go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas. My entire family knows it. Everybody knows this. And yet, in the recent banking crises, right, where we saw the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, the failure of Signature Bank, the failure of First Republic, big banks were once again the saviors of the system. And if we in fact see the United States hitting the debt ceiling, which I really hope we do not. But if we see that, and if the Treasury Department decides to do what I don't think it's going to do, by the way, Secretary Yellen has said she won't do this, but decides to actually continue to pay U.S. bills by issuing special bonds of some kind, the question is who will buy those bonds the day after the X date? There's all kinds of ways to structure the special bonds. That's not my expertise, but the question is who would buy them? And you know who is most likely to buy them and therefore yet again be the savior of the system. It is Jamie Dimon. It is JP Morgan Chase. It is Wells Fargo. It is Bank of America. It is Citigroup. So look, these are the complexities. And I do think we're at this enormously pivotal time in the role of the state in the American economy. And I do believe that these ideas have changed on the left and the right. There are no real credible neoliberals left in policy land. I said credible, but they're on their way out. But we're trying to work with a system that is not structured for the kinds of ideas that we have brought to bear.
Yes, so we are moving from more optimistic to less. Look, I know I don't want to be playing this role, but at the same time, okay, certainly we have started to get out of the era of sort of euphoric, neoliberal euphoria or whatever. But whether we are really out of neoliberalism at this stage, I think is really very much an open question. And it could be that we are really in some kind of neoliberal plateau, which could. So if you look at one simple indicator, which is evolution of inequality, either income inequality or the concentration of wealth, which I think is even more important than concentration of income, we are at a very high historical plateau and we've not started to decline. So, we are at a, we went back since the 1970s until today to basically to the level of the 1920s, more or less, in terms of what share of national wealth goes to the top 10% or top 1%. We are sort of back to the level of the 1920s, and we've not started to decline back. So if we just start with this kind of simple indicator, I certainly don't want to summarize everything with this, but still it's important because it's not just about money. It's of course it's mostly about power, concentration of power, who has economic power in the US economy and society. We have certainly not started anything like a decline. It looks more like a plateau at a very high level. So it's true that since the 2008 financial crisis, we are not really rising anymore as fast as before. Also at the very, very top, very top billionaire, so it's a really, very small fraction, they are rising, faster than ever. Remember, the top billionaire 10 years ago, at the time of 2008 financial crisis, the wealthiest people in the world, they own 30 or 40 billion, and they looked very rich at the time, but from the world of today, where the top billionaire, either Elon Musk in the US or Bernard Arnault in Europe, have each 200 or more, the people with 30, 40 look very poor. And you could say that's all very abstract. What difference does it make? This is just paper money. Well, it makes a big difference because when you have 200, for instance, you can buy something that's worth 40 very easily, even without noticing it. Whereas if you only own 30, of course, that's going to be difficult. So the concentration of power in corporate America and US society has certainly not started to decline. If anything, we are at a very high plateau, and in some way, it's still rising. So I think we have to keep cool. I think there are possibilities which exist, but we have to be very careful. It could be that we are entering some kind of neoliberal plateau. It could be that we are entering, certainly with Trump, some kind of neo-nationalism or some mixture of sort of nationalist neoliberalism, something like this. But are we entering some new deal or social democratic or I like to talk about democratic socialism order. I think unfortunately we are still quite far, and there's a lot of work in terms of political mobilization and organization and also intellectual platform. I think intellectuals, of course, have a role to play. They are not going to replace the labor movement and mass organization, but they certainly have a role to play. But we are quite far from there. Let me elaborate on this a little bit. If we look at I don't want to, what's going on in terms of industrial policy is important, certainly, with the Biden administration. But as you mentioned, if we look, there are two problems to me. First, it's certainly too early to say, the amounts, there's a lot of creative communication going on about the amounts and throwing, hundreds of billions every few months, and the Biden administration has been skilled for that, and especially in international communication. I don't know how much in domestic communication. But sometimes, in fact, when you dig a little more, what you find is, as you mentioned, that the biggest amount were really for the pandemic exceptional policy measures, which are already over. If you look at like the Inflation Reduction Act, the 400 billion initial plan, in fact, 400 billion, this is 2% of US GDP that you spend over 5 or 10 years. This is, in fact, extremely small. This has nothing to do with the kind of expansion of the states that you have during the New Deal. We are talking about something very small. And even if you get to 1.2 trillion, you have to see over how many years you spend it. I think, it's still in the air. Some of these numbers are sort of flying very high with lots of zeros, but then if you divide by the right denominator over the right time period, we have to see. That's the first problem. The second problem, which to me is even worse, is that in fact we're talking about tax credit, private subsidies to private capital accumulation. And, this could just be the continuation of tax competition in a more extreme way. And for this, I want to insist that if anything, tax competition since the 2008 financial crisis has become even bigger. And of course, there was a huge step that was achieved, well, so to speak, in the United States under Trump, with the huge reduction in the corporate tax rate. Let me remind you, for the Americans in the room, that for a long time, and for the Europeans as well, the US corporate tax rate, remained at 35% at the federal level, plus 5 or 10% at the state level, so you get to 40, 45. Whereas in Europe, countries, had reduced their tax rate toward 2010 or toward 0% for a long time. Now, the fact that Trump reduced the US corporate tax rate when he came to power in 2016 toward 15%, even though it has been increased a bit since then, is a major historical event, because it means that the US has been following Europe in the race to the bottom for corporate tax competition, and it's sort of paradoxical that this race has been led by Europe, but that's because in Europe you don't have a federal corporate tax, which you have in the US, which prevented, at least for a couple of decades, the competition to go even further in this direction. Now, I think this form of tax competition to attract investors, is not over yet. It's still, the corporate tax rate is, going towards zero. I know there's a minimal tax rate at 15% that has been sort of decided at OECD, but there are so many exceptions when you look at the details that you can actually get to 10, 5, and you're getting to zero. And even when you're at zero, that's not the end of tax competition, because then you can have subsidies, a negative taxation to attract investors. And, maybe this is a big part of what's happening with Biden is actually our subsidies to private capital accumulation. Look, I don't want to sound too negative. I'm not saying it's only this, but we have to be very careful and look at this very carefully. The second general point and sort of reason for being careful is that, I think if we want to reduce inequality in America or across the world, and if we really want to change up get out of the neoliberal political order in the US, this will have to involve an enormous return of progressive taxation. And so I know, after the 2008 financial crisis, this has become a topic of discussion in the US, in particular in 2016 election with Sanders, and even more maybe in 2020 primary campaign for the Democratic parties, where Sanders and Warren, well, especially Sanders, but Warren was sort of following Sanders on this, were advocating not only for a return of top income tax rate and top inheritance tax rate of 70, 80%, like those that were implemented under Roosevelt, which I think were a huge success historically, and I think it's time to reassess this period. I think on average between 1930 and 1980, the top income tax rate in the US was 81% at the federal level, and apparently this did not destroy US capitalism, otherwise we would have noticed it. But even more than that, this was the period of maximum US prosperity. If you look at US productivity in the post-war decade as compared to the rest of the world, this was the maximum gap ever. Why is it so? Well, because the key to prosperity is much more investment in education, human capital, public infrastructure, and there was enormous advance of the US over the rest of the Western world, and the rest of the world, of course, at that time, in particular in education in the 1950s. There's a huge educational advance of the US. You have 80-90% of a cohort going to high school in the 50s at a time when it's only 20-30% in France, West Germany, Japan. and you have to wait until the 1980s, 90s to have a catch-up, and also a catch-up in productivity. So the key of US prosperity in the 20th century was obviously this educational advance, which involved enormous collective mobilization, state intervention, and this is very much in line with the general spirit of this conference, that the developmental state and the construction of adequate state capacities through enormous democratic struggles that Noam studies so beautifully in his book in Brahmin Capitalism, and many others in the room have been working on. I think that's the real key for US prosperity. And in this set of policies, I really want to stress how important top-end progressive taxation is. And so going back to the 2020 election, Warren and Sanders were proposing to return to this kind of top tax rate, 70, 80% on very top incomes and inheritance. And maybe even most importantly, they were proposing to introduce something that was not introduced under Roosevelt, which was a highly progressive wealth tax, where they were proposing top annual tax rate on the stock of wealth, so not on the flow of income, up to 6-8% per year on billionaires, which is, I think, what we need, or probably a bit more than that even, but given the speed at which top billionaire wealth has been accumulating over the past decade, if you have a top tax rate on wealth of 2 or 3 or 4%, that's not going to do much. If you want to keep the situation under control and actually return to the more limited wealth concentration of the post-war era, you're going to need that kind of tax rate on top wealth. So the fact that Warren and Sanders were proposing something like this, I had the personal experience of having a public discussion in Boston in 2014 with Elizabeth Warren, where at the time when I was saying, okay, we should have a top wealth tax rate of 5-10% per year, she was saying, wow, no, that's too much, it's impossible. And to see, that in 2020 there was sort of a competition between Sanders and Warren to go in this direction is certainly a sign for change. But these two candidates got huge support in the Democratic primary, and if only the young would vote, or say the below, not just the very young. I think they had a big majority. If you just take the voters below 50, they would have won the primaries. Well, they would need to unite a bit better, maybe. But anyway, so all of this, maybe we are at the eve of something like this, but we are not there yet. And it will take an enormous constitutional battles over progressive taxation, in particular progressive taxation of wealth. It already did, in the first half of the 20th century, of course, but that's not an easy battle. You need to have enormous popular support. Are we there yet? I think the strength of private money into politics, into think tank, into universities, is such that this is going to be difficult. So there are possibilities. These are fights that can be won, that already have been won in the past. But this takes enormous political mobilization. Let me stress again. That's very important. This return of very high-end progressive taxation is very important for at least 3 reasons. First reason, you need funding to make real investment. And there is a lot of money to get out there. You will also need to ask funding to the middle class, upper middle class. But if you don't start by taking, all the fiscal resources that you can take at the top, there's obviously no way that the upper middle class is going to be willing to pay anything to help you. So, first thing, there's real money over there if you want to have real investment in schools, infrastructure, and real public investment, not just tax subsidies to the private wealth accumulation. So, first reason, real money. Next, this is the only way to reduce drastically inequality at the top end. Let me stress the fact that when you have very high top end and very top incomes, the historical evidence we now have, I think, which is quite clear in my view, is that the main effect is actually on pre-tax inequality. So it actually prevents extreme inequality in pay pre-tax to form in the first place. Because basically when you have a top tax rate of 90%, 95%, okay, you can always tell your subordinates, your shareholders that you want another 10 million in pay, but, if 90% of it is going straight to the treasury, probably people around you are going to tell you, look, keep cool, we are going to find other ways to make you happy, but we are not going to give you that much. At least this is what happened in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So on the basis of the evidence we have, it's a very powerful tool to compress, which is important not only for reason of social justice, but let me conclude with this. I think that's also very important if you have want to have an effective regulation policy. Because, you were mentioning antitrust regulation, there's all the issues obviously about regulating the financial sector, regulating algorithm in the high-tech sector. Now, if you have some, the sort of most qualified people, or people who are considered to be the most qualified, who are paid, 100 times the average wage at the top, you're not going to compete with that in your public regulatory agency. Well, you can try to do that, but that's a dead end. That's going to cost you too much, and you will never be able to compete. So reducing, having a huge pay compression, especially at the top, is a critical condition to conduct any proper regulatory policy in any of this area. Otherwise, then people will complain in the public antitrust agency, oh, we are not paid well enough to attract the best people, etc. Yeah, okay, but you should not compete. So here the real question at the end is, maybe there's a risk that the U.S. society, especially people in the top strata of U.S. society, have become accustomed to a level of inequality which now they feel is acceptable, including in academia and think tanks. Maybe, I don't want to be mean to anyone, but I think the level of salary in U.S. academia and U.S. think tanks, if I offer a European viewpoint, I've gone way too high, and people have become accustomed to see this as normal. And I think, that's there's a lot of work to be done to get back to an agenda of massive compression in pay and income, and so it's not only about Wall Street, it's also about main academic street. I don't know how to call it, but anyway, that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, as European academics, we definitely endorse this view. I want to give Gary and Felicia an opportunity to respond briefly to these comments, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
I'll just make two brief comments. One is that it is extremely notable that of all of the progressive agenda that many of us have been working on for a very long time, the piece that fell off in 2020 was the taxation piece, right? Wealth taxation was never part of candidate Biden's agenda. It was part of Elizabeth and Bernie's. It was not part of candidate Biden's. And then as, as he came into office, most of what he ended up focusing on was, sure, the expansion of fiscal policy with all the pandemic relief, but really then starting to work on climate and jobs with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was financed, which was the struggle around financing that was so narrow, and it would have been much broader and much smarter and much more generous had we been able to finance it with progressive taxation. Obviously, a wealth tax would have been tremendous, but even a more progressive taxation than what we had. And so this is, the fight over taxation in America is 400 years old and very complicated and very deep, but I very, 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 very much agree with you that the most important unfinished part of this agenda, and essentially the linchpin, is taxation. And then the other thing I would say, because you called throughout your comments for more democratic small d mobilization, we're not that great at that in the United States. We're not that great. The labor movement is very important, but obviously weakened for a lot of reasons, which we don't have to go into right now. been attacked by many on the right, and many neoliberal ideas are expressly anti-labor. But the other kinds of civic engagement, democratic mobilization that it's just really, the muscle's quite weak. And those are two very, very, very important things that could move us from what I sometimes call the sunny side of post-neoliberalism, which Joe Biden likes, money. I don't mean to criticize. People have worked very hard to get to the point where we are right now. But to move beyond the sunny side to a side that's actually going to control corporate power, we must do more, and people must be in the streets about it.
Thank you for pointing out the button to me. Two thoughts. As I think back to the New Deal order, in my book, I treat the New Deal as something naturally emerging out of the Great Depression. But that's not really right. The New Deal was in formation. What came to fruition in the 1930s was in formation for 30 years. Really began, or 40 years, began with the populists in the 1890s and continued through the New Deal in the 1930s. And I think that longitudinal perspective is very important, or temporal perspective is important to keep in mind, because if we think about this moment, how do we think of temporality? And we are trained by social media to demand immediate response, immediate success. But if we think of, if a new political progressive order is indeed in formation, where are we in that process? In other words, are we at when did it begin? Did it begin in 2010? Did it begin in 2015, 2016? Did it begin in 2020? And what's a realistic appraisal for when we can expect something of this sort to have the kind of success that you would like to see? If it began in 2010 or 2015, it may not be until 2030, 2035, 2040. And we have to keep that kind of perspective in mind, remembering that the achievements of the New Deal were the product of 30 or 40 years of struggle. The labor movement was essential to that earlier struggle. I don't think we have quite, there is a labor awakening going on in the United States right now, but we don't quite know whether the labor movement of the future can play that popular mobilization role that it had played in the past. And if it can't, what replaces it? And I'm with my two panelists in thinking that mobilization from below of a mass sort has been critical in the past to these successes and will be again. The other crucial element of this is a different kind of mobilization, which is electoral mobilization, which is not the same as labor movement mobilization. And can you have a thinner majority than what Joe Biden has in Congress? And if you think, what can you do with such a thin majority? I think he's really done quite well with a non-existent majority, which is what he has. And if Roosevelt had majorities, I don't have the figures on the top of my head, but in the House it was like 330 to 150, and in the Senate was 67 to 31 or something. I mean, 70% majority in both houses of Congress when all that powerful legislation was passed. And the Democratic Party is, if it's going to be successful, is going to have to figure out how to produce, if not majorities of that size, then something other than the current polarization between parties that paralyzes American politics, each party winning by the thinnest of margins. If that's going to be the condition of American politics over the 10 or 15 years, we probably won't progress much beyond the moment that we're in now. I will say, though, that the 2020 election was an extraordinary moment of democratic mobilization in the United States, and the defeat of Trump was an extraordinary achievement in the United States, and gives one hope that strategies of political mobilization can be found that will sustain that. But we have to talk about how that can be achieved, because if the current stasis persists, then the road ahead is probably not going to get us to the destination that we need.
Great, thank you. So We're going to start taking questions from the audience. I'm going to try to take them in clusters.
First of all, thank you. Wonderful panel. I think it started on September 15th, 2008. So we're 15 years in, and that maybe means we have 15 more years to go. I totally agree that the mobilization is going to be essential, and it's not totally clear how that's going to happen. So I agree with that part. But I actually want to address, Thomas, what you were saying, because I actually think there's a really interesting, actually intellectual point of difference here that's very characteristically different between America and the United States. If you look at the kind of settlement that we have had, political economic settlement we've had in the United States and in Europe over the last 40 years under the neoliberal era, but really it goes back further than that to the previous era of embedded liberalism. There's been two very different kinds of settlements in terms of how labor and capital are going to divide up, labor, capital, and state work together to provide basic welfare services. In the United States, in Europe, the model has been to have a large welfare state and a relatively low wage economy, with the state not making huge interventions. And so the reason why you have proponents like yourself, and I don't disagree with anything you're saying from a normative perspective, Thomas, but proponents in Europe of a high tax system is because there's a large welfare state. And so people have all sorts of social services that are provided to them for free. There's good public schools, there's good public transportation, college is free, healthcare is free, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't need a high wage to be able to have a decent middle class life because the state provides all of those things. The United States has had a very different model. The model has been the state doesn't provide. We have a very small welfare state, but we have a very large state that aims to produce high wage jobs so that you can buy all of those services on the private market. You have to pay for your kids to go to college. You have to pay for your health care. You have to pay for, maybe you even have to pay for private security now. I mean, we privatize everything in the United States. So the model has been to create a high wage economy. The way we've tried to handle welfare policies historically in the United States has been to create very high wage models. And so a lot of what the Biden administration, I think, is trying to do now is to create lots and lots of high paying jobs, because that's the model of welfare provision in the United States. It's not been to provide a welfare state, it's been to provide high-paying jobs. And I think a lot of the tension we're seeing over in Europe, and the reason Europeans are perceiving the Inflation Reduction Act as a trade war is because they're saying, oh my God, you're engaged in tax competition, you're engaged in, in investments in industries that are going to be competitive with our industries. Europe has tried to create a low-wage, high-welfare, high-export model in order to support its welfare state. And I think a lot of the disagreements that are happening between the United States, or misunderstandings between the United States and Europe about what the import of the IRA is, when Sullivan says, you Europeans should do these kinds of investments too. The Europeans say, we don't want to do these kinds of investments. This is tax competition. You're forcing our hand into tax competition, into investment competition, and we don't want to do that. And I think the disagreements about this have to do with the fundamentally different structures about the way in which welfare is going to be provided to the middle classes in particular in the two different societies. I don't have an answer for how to overcome that difference of opinion or difference of views, but I do think that understanding that difference of views is really important for understanding why the Europeans and the Americans don't see eye to eye on these issues.
Let me throw something else in the hopper here, which I spend my professional and activist life working in the protect democracy world. And I spend a lot of time writing about them with meetings, with activist groups, with people who in the United States who are desperately concerned that we are seeing the collapse of democratic institutions in the United States and the undermining them in potentially serious and potentially fatal ways. And one question which comes to my mind as I listen to this, and Gary, as I was listening to you on the topic, is it a coincidence? Imagine us as historians, 35 years from now. Is it a coincidence that the collapse of the neoliberal order would be accompanied by the most severe attacks on democracy itself in the United States that have occurred really since the Civil War? So I'm trying to invite you folks to take this crisis of democratic institutions into account in your versions of it, and that also leads, to I want to hear your more pessimistic prognostications, which is that if democracy is undermined, Gary, you talk about can we maintain the narrow majorities of the Democratic Party and Biden, but Biden's reelection is no sure thing. And Congress, it's no sure thing that the Democrats will hang on to the Senate or the House. I mean, what do these policies, what happens to neoliberalism in that case? If in fact the right seizes power and undermines institutions, in part with the help of the Supreme Court, undermines the institutions that would permit a democratic reaction against it. That's my optimism.
Thank you so much for your contributions. And I think I'm going to go in the same direction as my friend Alex. Yes, I would want to be optimistic. And after 30 or 40 years of defeats, it would be wonderful to be able to be optimistic. And yes, as a historian who is looking at the big picture of changes in the political economy of capitalism, it is certainly true that the political economy of capitalism has shifted fundamentally at certain historical moments. And thus, it is, I think, a reasonable assumption that the neoliberal order is going to come to an end at some point, and maybe we are witnessing that moment. I think there's some reasons to believe that this is indeed the moment we are living through. But is it really going to be better? Is it really going to be, a step to the kind of social democratic paradise that I hear in some of the contributions? And yes, that is possible. Historically, that transition has happened, but other transitions have happened too. And when I look around the world, when I go a little bit away from the kind of day-to-day accounts of American politics and what, is Biden doing and Trump doing and others are doing, but if I look at around the world, then I see, there is maybe a certain effort in some policy circles to address some of the issues of inequality. But I also see a world in which democracy is in retreat, not just in the United States, but in many, many different parts of the world. I see a world in which authoritarian governments are gaining greatly in power and influence. I see a world, and you just down, outside the window here 2 or 3 weeks ago, when the French government cut back on the pensions. That was not exactly an inspiring step towards the expansion of the welfare state, but just the opposite. And then when I see what concerns me the most, I think, as a historian, is this allegedly progressive effort to renationalize commodity chains. Because historically, that effort is also not without precedent. It has happened especially after the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And we know where that ended up. So this was not exactly a progressive outcome either. I'm not saying, I'm reluctant to predict the future because the future may prove me wrong, but I'm saying there are various kinds of futures imaginable that come out of a crisis of neoliberalism, and it is far from certain. And I think there I agree with Thomas, where we are on this trajectory right now. And I think we need to be a little more careful to also see that that things could be worse, that things could be in the future that are quite concerning and that need to be addressed as well. Thank you.
Are there other questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you. I thought what you said about people on the streets and that we need more mobilization I thought this was very uplifting. But my question is rather blunt. How do you square people on the street with mass gun ownership?
Thank you. So I have 3 questions, or just one. Collective action problem regarding global climate change. And I wonder what you see in terms of progressive politics, especially the responsibility of developed nations regarding the rest of the world that still needs to be developed. And whether you see any continuities in terms of industrial policy advocated by the Trump wing, in the sense that they kind of anticipated how strategic it was to build some resilience in supply chains. Thanks.
Okay.
Having just been at the Anti-Monopoly Summit in Washington, I was impressed by the determination of the organizers and many of the speakers to build bridges with traditional Republican constituencies around issues of common concern. And that strategy is very different from increase the welfare state, taxation, because that's not a strategy that's going to easily bridge partisan divide. And in an age when the majorities are so paper thin, I'm wondering about this structural realignment domestically as a way to bring about industrial policy.
Okay, so yes, I think basically respond to whatever makes sense to you, whatever sticks out as relevant.
That's a complicated statement to make, but yes. Okay, let me pick a few questions. Let me start with your remark on the high wage versus low wage economy. Let me remind you one thing. If we look at productivity, GDP per hours of work, the US and Germany and France are basically at the same level since the 1980s, 90s. So in terms of wage, by definition, the total labor compensation per hours of work, is going to be roughly the same. So there was a huge productivity gap back in the 50s, 60s, but it has basically closed. And since the 80s, 90s, you have basically the same GDP per hours of work. You take Bureau of Labor Statistics series, OECD series. It's complicated to measure hours of work, but whatever we do, whatever we have, this is the kind of conclusion. So it's not, because when you say high wage versus low wage economy, one could hear, okay, you have a higher productivity in the US, lower productivity in Europe. That's not the kind of world we have in front of us. This was the case in the 50s, but today we have the same productivity. Then there's a question of how you use your labor compensation, and indeed you're right. In the US, there's a lower level of social contribution, taxation, and then you buy your health insurance yourself, your pension fund yourself. Now, is it good in terms of total purchasing power at the end? As you know, it's not so clear, because when you spend 20% of GDP in your health sector with the kind of health indicators that you have, I don't think that's so good for the competitiveness of your US economy or whatever. Why should you spend 20% of GDP to have such bad health outcomes? So I think, it's better to actually spend less and have a higher health outcome. So, this high wage strategy, which you seem to be describing as a sort of rational economic strategy. I mean, some people want to pretend that it is rational, but I think it's very difficult to speak in the name of economic rationality when you have this kind of evidence. At the end of the day, the truth is that we have a productivity stagnation, both in the US and in Europe since the 1990s, as compared to previous decades. And I think that's largely due to the education stagnation. I mean, it could be also due to other factors which, we could have a less productivity growth for good reason. Maybe we should stop using the natural resources like we've used them. We're going to, there's a rising price of energy, etc. So maybe, there are other reasons, but I don't think for the period 1990 to 2020, this is the shift factor. I think the shift factor has been stagnation in educational investment, which has sort of stabilized since the 1980s, 1990s at 5-6% of national income versus less than 1% of national income before World War I, and then we've stabilized at 5-6% of national income since the 1980s, 1990s, on both sides of the Atlantic, in spite of the fact that the fraction of a generation going to higher education has gone from 20% to 60%. So this means that per capita investment has been reduced. If you want to understand the reason for a stagnation of productivity, I think that's probably the chief explanation. So when we're talking about how you get high wages, how we get high productivity, I think we have to go back to the basics, and this kind of educational investment, is hugely more important in the long run than any tax credit to the businesses. And let me say again, on this front, when you analyze the difference in US and European strategy, certainly in Europe, there's a sort of obsession with competition policy and obsession against industrial policies that I certainly don't want to endorse. But here, what we have in front of us is a situation where actually the US has been, in a way, following Europe in terms of going further into tax competition. Europe has been the leader in corporate tax competition, and in fact, the US under Trump and then Biden with the tax rate is sort of following on this, and it's not good at all to follow Europe on this front. I think this is what we have. Let me be much shorter on the other question, because I know it's, we other speakers to hear about the demise of political institution and the role, the key role of this, in the current crisis. I fully agree with this, and something that I really like in Gary's book, which, by the way, I was very happy to have the opportunity of this panel to read it a bit faster than I would have liked to, but at least this was very informative, and I loved many parts of the book, but one part that I particularly like was the way when we talk about polarization of American political life, as you very clearly explain, in terms of economic doctrine. In fact, we have a large consensus. We've had at least a large neoliberal consensus for a long time, and I think we still have a large neoliberal consensus. About economic policy, taxation policy. And so the kind of polarization that we have maybe is due to the fact that, because there's too much consensus on economic issues, and you have this cultural war about, as you say, the neo-Victorian moral agenda versus the cosmopolitan agenda, and you have the war is going to be on this, and that's a sort of war in many ways with no solution, a pure war that does not really offer any political solutions that you can offer in many cases. And so I think we need to get out of the economic consensus and to have some economic fight anymore. And I think this is, again, I want to say, this is where intellectuals, historians, political scientists, have a role to play, and you should not let economists talk about tax policy and economic policies, and you should take a stand, including on progressive taxation. You should, I think we need, I've always thought, but maybe I'm wrong, that part of the demise of the New Deal order and progressive taxation was insufficient, certainly collective appropriation of the New Deal agenda, but in particular among intellectuals. When Hayek and Friedman were writing in the 60s, 70s, they were very clear about the fact that their objective was the demolition of the progressive tax system, perfectly clear. You read Rawls' Theory of Justice, 1971, you can use the principles put by Rawls to defend and progressive taxation, but it remains very abstract in the book, and there's no explicit reference. We live in the middle of the era where top tax rates are 80-90%, but he never talks explicitly about this. Maybe he feels that's not philosophical enough, but except that the people on the other side, they are very explicit about what they want. They want to demolish this. And at the end of the day, I think we need intellectuals from all fields and all disciplines, to enter into this battle and to take a stand. And I'm not saying that's going to be sufficient, but I think that's necessary. Yeah, there are many other questions.
Hello. Yes. Intellectuals getting in the fight in addition to mobilization in the streets. I actually think both are correct. And I actually think the reason we've seen as much change as we have, the reason we even have a conversation about the wealth tax in the United States, which, as you know probably better than anybody, was absolutely off the table 10 years ago and is no longer, is actually because intellectuals have gotten into the fight. But I just wanted to say two things, one about decarbonization and one about democracy. I think it's important to note that the IRA, Niels, is not just a high wage jobs strategy. That, in fact, is an ancillary benefit, but this is actually a strategy to decarbonize, to basically electrify all of America, and hopefully both Europe and the globe. This is extremely important. And so this is, it is also not, somebody said that it was about renationalizing commodity chains. It's actually not that. It's about transforming the economic system so it operates on a different source of energy. This is a very complicated problem that is not just about commodities, although it will certainly include commodities, rare earth minerals and the materials to make solar and wind panels in the United States. But this is actually an economic transformation, like the agricultural revolution, like the industrial revolution. And it is very important to remember it as that. And this is why I do think that the Biden team was smart to put that on the same path as they put the infrastructure investments. So I think that's very important. I will also say that absolutely, it is my hope, I'm not a European, but I have been listening to the conversation. It is my hope that the US and Europe will find ways to subsidize in whichever ways are appropriate, because we do actually need state subsidies to speed up the green transformation in the United States and in Europe. There is a tremendous amount of work to be done, technological, manufacturing, labor market, in order to decarbonize. So I hope that once that happens, we see a whole lot of technology transfer. And I think we need a kind of green industrial strategy fund for the entire world. Maybe you'd put it at the World Bank, maybe you'd put it somewhere else. I don't know, but I actually think that's an incredibly important thing, or it won't work. It won't work politically and it won't work scientifically. Quickly on democracy, there's a lot to say about that. Perhaps over cocktails we can talk about that. But what I will say is that one important piece in democracy is making sure that the United States government can operate and function. Deliverism is not everything, but boy, we better be able to actually have an IRS that taxes people appropriately. We better be able to have a Department of Energy that can actually get money out to communities that need it. This is an important part of democracy, and that is what many of us are fighting for, and we see it as very, very, very important to the democracy fight.
I think all the is this on? Yeah. All the important issues are on the table, and we need weeks of cocktails to make progress on them. I would like to comment on 3 items: democracy, anti-monopoly, and renationalization of commodity flows. I don't mean to neglect authoritarianism. I'm coming back to Paris next week to talk about authoritarianism. Democracy is in a frail state right now, not just in the US, but globally. In the US, if Trump wins in 2024, I think American democracy is finished, not for all time, but temporarily. And I find myself, as a historian of the United States, reading about other countries that lost their democracy and had a struggle to get it back. And I never thought, as a US historian, I would be reading that literature. And it's an indication of the US being thrown into a pot with a lot of other nations. And I do believe the struggle for democracy is irrepressible and will always return in some form. But the US is faced with a very serious crisis. And I don't mean to suggest that Biden is going to win in 2024. Trump could win, and we should not discount that possibility. But we should also take hope and understand that the issue has not been decided, and even though we can point to all the authoritarian regimes in the world, which seem to be multiplying, they also have suffered serious defeats, either at the polls or through mass demonstrations. Bolsonaro lost in Brazil, a huge defeat. Trump lost in the US, a huge defeat. The mass mobilizations that have been going on this year, or let's take it back a couple of years, 2020, the George Floyd mass mobilization of 25 million people, the French mobilizations that have been going on this spring, the mobilizations in Israel against what Netanyahu is trying to do. There are people fighting for what they believe their democracy should be, and that fight is far from finished. So I want to refine the question a little bit by asking, what do we have to do to turn those episodic mass protests into something more permanent and more enduring, something that can be institutionalized and inserted and embedded in government and provide what the labor movement once provided all around the world, and to make these protests something other than peasants rising up every so often against their overlords. And we can understand a lot of history in that way. There's never been any shortage of peasant revolts, but the peasant revolts leading to revolution or transformation or enduring democracy have been a lot rarer. And if the labor movement can no longer function in the way it has in the past, what replaces it? And what can provide the force for democratic upsurges? What can be the hammer, so to speak? There's a very depressing part of Thomas' book, which is that the period of great inequality was facilitated by 2 world wars, 100 million people dead, a tremendous, literally, destruction of property. I have my own, in a sense, pessimistic story. The constraint on capital during the glory years of the New Deal era was provided by the communist threat as a check on capital. How do we replace that form of check on capital expansion? And how do we supply that incentive for capital to compromise in circumstances that it otherwise wouldn't, without bringing back communism, which to me ultimately is an indefensible system of tyranny? I can frame the question, but I ask a lot, and I get asked a lot, if communism was so important in producing something in the past, a kind of compromise, a settlement between capital and labor, what is the force that is going to provide that in the future? Which is another way of saying we don't know the institutional forms that a successful struggle for democracy is going to need. We are in the process of seeking them out and inventing them. We don't yet know what they are. Anti-monopoly, reaching across political divides. Yes, there is the possibilities of coalition between the Republican and Democratic parties, as there was for the CHIPS piece of legislation, which drew together Democrats and Republicans. There are constituencies in the Republican Party that favor industrial policy, as there are in the Democratic Party, and there's both possibility and opportunity there, and peril for the obvious reasons. And finally, on the renationalization of commodity chains, we are heading to a different form of globalization than the one that we've had in the neoliberal era. And so I'm not immediately upset about what the U.S. has done in terms of the IRA. I think it seems to me the reaction that it has triggered from the EU has been a very productive reaction and leading to precisely the kind of conversation we need to be having about what the future holds. But I also don't think what we yet know what form a future globalization should take that is not neoliberal in form. And we have to put that issue on the table and discuss it. So the initial steps taken by the US in that regard, I regard as being productive in advancing the conversation, even if we ultimately become critical of this as being too protectionist. But beware of invoking terms like protectionism and mercantilism, because they immediately have negative connotations. We should have a more neutral term for what may be happening, a kind of strategic globalization that will replace the current form of globalization, which has been judged in so many parts of the world to have failed.
Okay, thank you for a terrific panel, and thank you all for participating and for the excellent questions.